My mother threatened to cut me from her will unless I married her choice. I showed her that her money meant nothing to me. My mother, Renata, controlled everything in our family with money. She inherited a significant fortune from my grandfather and used it like a weapon her entire life. She decided where we lived based on what neighborhoods impressed her friends. She decided what schools we attended based on whose children went there. She decided what careers we pursued based on what sounded prestigious at dinner parties. Every major decision in my life had to pass through her approval or face the threat of financial consequences. Growing up, I didn't realize this was unusual. I thought all mothers held money over their children's heads. I thought phrases like, "You'll get nothing when I die," were normal parts of family conversations. I thought love and inheritance were the same thing. By the time I understood how twisted this was, I was already deep in the cycle of trying to earn her approval. I became a lawyer because she wanted a lawyer in the family. I dated people she approved of because she threatened to stop paying my student loans if I didn't. I attended events I hated and smiled at people I couldn't stand because she reminded me constantly that my future comfort depended on staying in her good graces. My younger brother figured out the game earlier than I did. He rebelled at 17 and moved across the country at 18. My mother cut him off completely and told everyone he was dead to her. She changed her will publicly and made sure the whole family knew he would receive nothing. She used him as an example of what happened when children disobeyed. I watched and learned to stay quiet. Then I met someone my mother didn't choose. His name was Franklin, and he worked as a carpenter. He built custom furniture for wealthy clients and made a decent living doing work he genuinely loved. We met at a coffee shop when he complimented the book I was reading. We talked for 2 hours, and I gave him my number without thinking about what my mother would say. For the first 6 months, I kept Franklin's secret. I told my mother I was too busy with work to date. I saw him on weekends and pretended I was visiting friends. I fell in love while lying to everyone about it. Eventually, my mother found out because she always found out. She had friends everywhere who reported back to her. Someone saw me with Franklin at a restaurant and described him as working class. My mother called me immediately demanding an explanation. I told her the truth. I said I'd been dating someone for 6 months and I was happy. She asked what he did for a living. I told her. She said absolutely not. She said I would end things immediately or face consequences. She said she had someone better in mind for me. His name was Lawson, and he was the son of one of her wealthy friends. He worked in finance and came from old money and looked exactly like the kind of husband my mother could brag about. She'd been planning this match for years, apparently. She just hadn't told me until now. I said I wasn't interested in Lawson. I said I was in love with Franklin. She said love was irrelevant and financial security was what mattered. She said Franklin could never provide the life I deserved. She said if I didn't end things and give Lawson a chance, she would remove me from her will entirely. I would get nothing. Not the house, not the investments, not the jewelry, not any of it. I would be as dead to her as my brother was. I asked for time to think. She gave me 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I did a lot of thinking, but not about what she expected. I thought about my brother, who had been cut off for years and somehow survived. I thought about Franklin, who built beautiful things with his hands and never once asked about my family's money. I thought about myself and the person I had become trying to please a woman who only loved me conditionally. I thought about what I actually wanted from life versus what my mother had decided I should want. At the end of 2 weeks, I called my mother. I told her I chose Franklin. She said she was disappointed, but not surprised. She said I was making the biggest mistake of my life. She said she would have her lawyer change the will by the end of the week. She said I should remember this moment when I was struggling in a few years while Lawson's wife lived comfortably. Then she hung up. I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt free. The threat she had held over me my entire life finally landed, and I was still standing. She had no more power over me because she had used her only weapon. I couldn't be threatened with something that had already happened. I threw myself into building a life that didn't depend on her money. I worked harder at my law firm and got promoted twice in 3 years. I moved in with Franklin, and we bought a small house together. I reconnected with my brother, who had built a successful life without any family support. I learned that money from my mother would have come with strings attached forever, and I was better off earning my own. My mother didn't speak to me for 2 years. She told relatives I had chosen a construction worker over my own family. She told her friends I had thrown away my future for someone beneath me. She painted herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter who didn't appreciate sacrifice. Then her health started declining. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was already in bed reading while Franklin worked on furniture designs at his desk in the corner. I almost didn't answer because unknown numbers that late usually meant spam, but something made me pick up. My Aunt Macy's voice came through shaky and rushed. She said my mother collapsed in her bathroom that evening. She said the paramedics took her to Memorial Hospital. She said it was her heart, and it looked bad. I grabbed a pen from the nightstand with hands that wouldn't stay steady. I wrote the room number on the back of an envelope, while Macy kept talking about cardiac failure and emergency treatment. Franklin looked up from his sketches when he heard my voice change. He stood and came over before I even finished the call. He said he would drive me there right now if I wanted to go. I nodded because I couldn't make words come out properly. We got dressed in silence. Franklin found my shoes while I stared at the room number I'd written. The drive took 20 minutes through empty streets. Franklin didn't ask if I was okay because he knew I wasn't. He just drove and kept one hand on my knee whenever he wasn't shifting gears. The hospital parking garage smelled like oil and antiseptic. We took the elevator to the 4th floor. The fluorescent lights in the cardiac unit made everything look too bright and too cold at the same time. A nurse at the desk pointed down the hall when I gave my mother's name. Room 4C was the 3rd door on the left. I stopped walking about 15 feet away from it. Franklin stopped with me. I could see through the small window in the door. My mother lay in the bed hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair was loose instead of perfectly styled. Her face had no makeup. She wore a hospital gown instead of the designer clothes she always insisted on. I stood there counting the machines around her bed. Franklin touched my shoulder gently. He asked if I needed more time. I shook my head and made myself walk forward. My hand reached for the door handle. I pushed it open. The room smelled like hand sanitizer, and that specific hospital smell that's impossible to describe. My mother's eyes were closed. Then they opened. She turned her head on the pillow and saw me standing in the doorway. Her eyes got wide. She looked genuinely shocked that I was actually there. I walked closer to the bed. Franklin stayed near the door to give us space. My mother opened her mouth and the first words out were asking where I'd been for 2 years. Not hello. Not thank you for coming. Just an accusation wrapped up as a question, like she hadn't been the one who cut me off completely. Like I was the one who disappeared. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. I said I was here now to see how she was doing. I asked what the doctors told her. She stared at me for a long moment. I could see her deciding whether to push the guilt trip further or accept what I was offering. She chose to let it go for now. She said her heart was failing. She said they caught it before she died, but it was close. A doctor came in about 10 minutes later. He was young with tired eyes and coffee stains on his white coat. He looked at me and asked if I was family. I said I was her daughter. He nodded and started explaining in terms I barely followed about cardiac function and valve problems and surgical options. He said my mother needed surgery within the next few days. He said recovery would take months. He said she would need care and support and probably couldn't live alone for a while. I asked about success rates. I asked about risks. I asked practical questions while my mother watched me from the bed. I could feel her looking for signs of either total devotion or complete abandonment. I gave her neither. I just listened to the doctor and took notes on my phone. Franklin drove me home around 2 a.m. I called my boss from the car and left a message saying I'd be late to work. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Franklin snored softly beside me. The next week turned into a blur of hospital visits squeezed between work obligations. I went Tuesday evening after finishing a deposition. I went Thursday during my lunch break and ate a sandwich in the parking garage afterward. My mother acted grateful but also wounded, like I should be there more. Like I should drop everything and camp out in her room. Franklin noticed I came home tense and quiet after each visit. He found me Saturday morning staring at my coffee without drinking it. He sat down across from me at our small kitchen table. He said he was worried about me. He said I seemed exhausted and anxious all the time now. He said I needed to figure out what level of involvement I could actually handle before this consumed me. His words made sense, but I didn't know how to answer. My brother Juliet called me the following Monday. I was at work reviewing contracts when my phone buzzed with his number. We hadn't talked in a few months. He said he heard through family gossip that our mother was in the hospital. He asked how bad it was. I told him everything the doctors said. We ended up talking for 2 hours. We shared stories about our mother's patterns. We realized we both felt the same confusing mix of concern and resentment. He felt guilty for being relieved he lived across the country. I felt guilty for only visiting twice a week. Talking to him helped more than I expected. It made me feel less alone in having complicated feelings about our mother almost dying. I went back to the hospital Wednesday evening. I walked down the familiar hallway toward room 4C. A man in an expensive suit stepped out from the waiting area near the elevators. I recognized him as Alexei, one of my mother's oldest friends. He said my name and walked toward me with purpose. He said we needed to talk. He backed me into a corner near the vending machines. He said I needed to forgive and forget, because family was everything. He said my mother was sick and scared. He said this was my chance to fix our relationship. He said blood was thicker than water and I was being stubborn. I kept my voice polite but firm. I said he didn't know the full story. I said I was doing what I could manage. I said this was between my mother and me. He looked disappointed, like he expected me to break down and promise to be the perfect daughter. I walked past him to my mother's room. She was sitting up in bed picking at a dinner tray. I pulled a chair close and asked how she was feeling. She said she was tired. She said the surgery was scheduled for Friday morning. Then she started talking in that careful voice she used when she wanted something. She said she'd been thinking. She said she handled things badly 2 years ago. She said she was sorry I felt hurt by her decisions. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The non-apology was so obvious it almost made me laugh. Sorry I felt hurt. Not sorry for what she did. Sorry I had feelings about it. Like my reaction was the problem instead of her actions. I felt the small hope I'd been carrying deflate. She still didn't understand what she did wrong. She couldn't take real responsibility. I said I appreciated her trying. I didn't say anything else. The attorney called Thursday morning while I was in a meeting with a client. I saw Gil Farmer's name on my phone screen and stepped out to take it. He said he was my mother's estate attorney. He said my mother asked him to contact me about updating her will. He said she wanted to make changes now that she was facing her mortality. I felt anger rise hot and sharp. Even from a hospital bed facing surgery, she was using her will as a tool. She couldn't just be sick. She couldn't just let me help without turning it into a transaction. I told Gil I didn't want to discuss her will while she was sick. I said it felt wrong to talk about inheritance when she might die on an operating table. He said he understood, but he was following her instructions. I hung up and stood in the hallway outside the conference room, trying to breathe normally. Work got harder to focus on. I sat in client meetings and realized I hadn't heard the last 5 minutes of conversation. I reviewed documents and had to reread the same paragraph 4 times. My boss noticed during an important meeting with a potential client. I blanked on a simple question about timeline. She covered for me smoothly but pulled me aside afterward. She asked if everything was okay. I said I had some family stuff going on. She said to let her know if I needed time off. I realized I needed to set clearer boundaries before this crisis ate my whole life. I couldn't be the daughter my mother wanted, and also be the lawyer my firm needed. I had to choose what I could actually give and accept that it wouldn't be enough for everyone. I came home that evening and Franklin was in the kitchen making dinner. He asked how my day was, and I said fine. He mentioned he'd picked up groceries and noticed we were low on coffee. I snapped at him about leaving the grocery bags on the counter instead of putting things away immediately. He stopped chopping vegetables and looked at me. The kitchen got quiet except for something simmering on the stove. He said I'd been on edge for days and he was worried about me. I told him I was handling it. He put down the knife and said I wasn't handling it, I was letting it consume me. He said he watched me turn into someone else every time I came back from the hospital. He said my mother spent years controlling me with money and now she was controlling me with guilt, and I was letting it happen all over again. He said he worried I was losing myself trying to be the perfect daughter for someone who never treated me well. His words landed hard because they were true. I'd been so focused on doing the right thing that I forgot to protect myself from falling back into old patterns. I apologized for snapping at him. He came over and hugged me and said we needed to figure out what I could actually give without destroying myself in the process. Juliet called 2 days later saying he'd booked a flight. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon and we drove straight to the hospital. I felt nervous about bringing him because my mother hadn't seen him in over 5 years. We rode the elevator up to her floor without talking much. When we walked into her room together, my mother's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise first, then something that looked like fear, then something softer I couldn't quite name. She stared at both of us standing there, her 2 rejected children in one room. Juliet said hello and asked how she was feeling. She said she was tired, but recovering. The 3 of us sat in awkward silence for a few minutes. Then my mother started crying quietly. She said she never thought she'd see both of us together again. She said she'd made terrible choices and pushed away the people who mattered most. Juliet and I exchanged glances. It wasn't a full apology, but it was closer than anything she'd said before. We stayed for an hour and talked about neutral things like the weather and the hospital food. When we left, Juliet said that was harder than he expected, but also better somehow. My Aunt Macy caught me in the hospital parking lot the next day. She'd been visiting my mother and saw me walking to my car. She asked if we could talk for a minute. We sat on a bench outside the main entrance. Macy said my mother had been talking to her about how lonely the past 2 years had been. She said my mother missed me and Juliet more than she'd admit to us directly. She said our mother was too proud to say she was wrong, but clearly felt bad about losing her children over money and control. Macy said she'd watched my mother look at old photos and cry when she thought no one was watching. I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was understanding that my mother was suffering too. Macy said she wasn't making excuses for what my mother did, just wanted me to know that my mother did have regrets even if she couldn't say it properly. I thanked Macy for telling me. She hugged me and said family was complicated but worth fighting for when possible. 3 days after her surgery, my mother had a setback. Her heart rate dropped and the monitors started beeping. Nurses rushed in and pushed me out of the room. I stood in the hallway watching through the window as they worked on her. A doctor came out 20 minutes later and said she'd stabilized, but it had been close. He said the next 24 hours were critical. I called Juliet and Franklin, and then I went back into her room. My mother looked so small in the hospital bed with all the tubes and wires. I sat down and took her hand carefully. It felt thin and cold. She squeezed back weakly without opening her eyes. We sat like that for hours. I didn't say anything, and neither did she, but something changed between us in that silence. I realized I didn't want her to die with all this anger and distance between us. I wanted her to know I loved her even though she'd hurt me. I wanted to find some kind of peace before it was too late. When my mother finally stabilized and woke up properly, she seemed different, softer somehow. She asked me about my life with Franklin in a way that sounded actually curious instead of judgmental. I told her about our house and how Franklin had built most of our furniture by hand. I described the dining table he'd made from reclaimed wood and the bookshelves he'd designed for my law books. She listened without interrupting or criticizing. She asked what kind of work Franklin was doing now. I explained he'd gotten a contract making custom pieces for a new hotel downtown. She said that sounded like good work. The conversation felt strange and fragile, like we were both trying hard not to break whatever small connection we'd found. I left that day feeling something I hadn't felt about my mother in years. Hope, maybe, or at least possibility. The next week, I ran into my mother's nurse in the hallway. Her name was Catherine, and she'd been taking care of my mother since the surgery. Catherine stopped me and said she wanted to tell me something. She said my mother talked about me all the time. She said there was a photo of me on the bedside table that my mother looked at constantly. I was surprised because my mother never showed that kind of open affection before. Catherine said my mother had mentioned several times how much she missed having me in her life. She said my mother seemed to regret a lot of her past choices. I thanked Catherine for telling me. It made me wonder if being sick had changed my mother's view on what actually mattered. Maybe facing death made her realize that money and control meant nothing compared to having people who loved you. 2 weeks after the surgery, my mother asked if we could talk seriously. I pulled my chair close to her bed. She said she'd been thinking a lot while lying there recovering. She said she was wrong to try to control my life the way she did. She said she did it because she wanted me to be secure and comfortable. She said she grew up with nothing and spent her whole life afraid of being poor again. She said she thought money could protect me from suffering. I told her that real security comes from being loved for who you are, not what you do or who you marry. I said feeling controlled and conditional wasn't security at all. My mother started crying. It was the first time I could remember seeing her actually cry with real emotion instead of angry tears. She said she understood that now, but wished she'd understood it sooner. She said she wasted so many years being afraid and trying to control things that didn't need controlling. I reached over and held her hand while she cried. A few days later, my mother said she wanted to meet Franklin properly. Not just see him in passing, but actually talk to him and get to know him. I felt nervous about it, but agreed. I brought Franklin to the hospital that weekend. My mother was sitting up in bed looking more alert than she had in weeks. She shook Franklin's hand and thanked him for coming. Then she started asking him questions about his work and his family and how we met. Franklin answered everything honestly and patiently. He talked about learning carpentry from his grandfather and why he loved working with wood. He talked about meeting me in the coffee shop and knowing immediately that he wanted to get to know me better. My mother asked pointed questions about his business and his plans for the future. Franklin didn't get defensive or try to impress her. He just told the truth about loving his work and loving me, and building a good life together. I watched my mother's face while he talked and saw her really listening for the first time. After Franklin left, my mother was quiet for a while. Then she said she could see why I chose him. She said he clearly loved me and treated me well. She said he seemed like a good man who made me happy. It wasn't a full apology for everything she'd put me through. It wasn't even close to making up for the years of control and threats. But it was something. It was her acknowledging that my choice was valid and that I knew what was right for my own life. That meant more than I expected it to. Gil called me the following week. He said my mother had given him new instructions about her will. He said she wanted to restore me as a beneficiary. I went to the hospital and asked my mother about it directly. She said she wanted to do right by me while she still could. I told her I didn't want her money if it came with conditions or expectations. I said I'd built a life without it, and I was fine. She said there were no conditions this time. She said she just wanted to know I'd be taken care of if something happened to her. She said it wasn't about control anymore. It was about love. I didn't know if I believed that completely, but I could see she was trying. I coordinated with Juliet about taking my mother to her follow-up appointment the next week. We met at the hospital entrance and walked together to the cardiology wing where they'd scheduled her checkup. My mother sat between us in the waiting room and reached for both our hands at the same time. Her fingers felt thin and cold, but her grip was firm. She looked at me first, then at Juliet, and her eyes filled with tears. She said she'd been thinking a lot during her recovery about all the years she wasted trying to control us instead of just loving us. She said she could have been enjoying having us in her life this whole time, but she was too busy being proud and stubborn. She said she finally understood what she lost when she cut us off, and she was sorry it took almost dying for her to figure it out. Juliet squeezed her hand, and I felt my throat get tight. The nurse called her name, and we all stood up together. After the appointment showed good progress, I suggested we plan a family dinner at our house. My mother looked surprised, but agreed immediately. Franklin and I spent the weekend getting ready for the dinner. He cleaned the house while I cooked, and we both felt nervous about having my mother in our space for the first time. Juliet arrived first with a bottle of wine, then Aunt Macy showed up with flowers, and finally my mother came carrying a store-bought dessert. I watched her walk through our small living room and look at everything. She stopped at the dining table Franklin had built, and ran her hand across the smooth wood surface. She asked Franklin how long it took to make, and he explained the process of selecting the wood and joining the pieces. She listened carefully and said it was beautiful work, and she could tell he put real care into it. Franklin looked pleased and a little shocked. We sat down to eat, and the conversation stayed light at first. Macy told stories about family members, and Juliet talked about his work. My mother asked Franklin questions about his business and actually seemed interested in his answers. She complimented the food and thanked me for hosting. At one point, I looked around the table and realized this was exactly the kind of family gathering I'd always wanted. but never thought we could have. Everyone was relaxed and genuine, and nobody was performing for anyone else. After dinner, we moved to the living room and talked for another hour before people started leaving. My mother hugged me at the door and thanked me again for including her. 3 months passed, and my mother continued recovering well. We established a routine of talking on the phone every week and having dinner once a month. The first time I had to say no to one of her requests, I braced myself for a fight. She'd asked me to attend a charity event with her on a night I already had plans with Franklin. I explained I couldn't make it, and waited for her to push back or guilt me. Instead, she just said okay, and asked if we could do lunch the following week instead. That moment proved to me she was actually capable of respecting boundaries when she chose to. Our relationship wasn't perfect, and probably never would be. She still made comments sometimes that showed her old way of thinking, but when I called her on it, she apologized and tried to do better. She asked about Franklin's work and remembered details from our conversations. She reached out to Juliet regularly and made an effort to repair that relationship too. The change wasn't dramatic or complete, but it was real and consistent. I started to believe this new version of our relationship might actually last. I sat in our living room one evening with Franklin looking through photos on my phone from the family dinner. He pointed at one of my mother laughing at something Juliet said, and mentioned how different she looked compared to the stern woman in the hospital months ago. I scrolled through more pictures and realized something important. I'd spent years thinking the only way to win with my mother was to either submit completely or cut her off entirely. But I'd found a third option that I never knew existed. I got my family back, but on terms that felt honest and healthy instead of manipulative and conditional. My mother would never be the warm, unconditionally loving parent I wished I'd had growing up. She would always have that controlling streak and that need to manage situations. But she was trying now in ways she never did before, and that effort meant something real. I'd learned that sometimes good enough is actually enough, and that imperfect relationships can still be valuable if both people are willing to work at them. Franklin put his arm around me and asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was just grateful for how things turned out, and I meant it.